So this is planning a takeover, a success story in implementing Storybook, Drupal 10, and Layout Builder. The slides here, if you haven't already captured this QR code, are here in a bit.ly link, DCon25 Takeover. I'll have this available at the end of the presentation as well for you to get it. So before we get started, a little bit about myself. Hello, my name is Mike Miles. I actually looked today on Drupal.org, and I've been working with Drupal for 15 years and 12 months. That's what it said on Drupal.org. Not 16 years, but 15 years and 12 months. Uh, I do a lot in Drupal. I'm one of the organizers of New England Drupal Camp. You should come out in November for that. I'm also right now the vice president of the event organizers working group to help all events, not DrupalCon, but like local events happen and help with that. I work as the director of web development at MIT Sloan, which is the School of Management at MIT, where my team and I are responsible for the public-facing web properties of the school, mainly the school's website, mitsloan.mit.edu, which, spoiler alert, it's built in Drupal 10. If you want to know more about me, my website is mike-miles.com. You can read about me if you want to, and I'm all over the internet at MikeMiles86. Mainly, I'm active on like the Drupal Slack or LinkedIn. I don't really do too much social media, but you can find me with that handle. All right, so part of my job in the Office of Communications as the web director is talking with our product team about ways we want to update the website. So it wasn't surprising to me when one day they came to me and said, "Hey, Mike, can we talk to you about a new concept we want to add to the website?" Has anybody here ever heard something similar like that be addressed to them? Yeah, lots of agreement. Yeah, so I'm like, sure, what do you got for me this time? And they presented to me this wonderful design, which I've done a very bad job of putting into a slide, of a concept of a takeover page, something that was going to take over the home page for a given amount of time. And the idea of this, they could be unique one-off pages that we could give editors the ability to build in place. They wanted to really have a visual interface to build these pages. Our designer, Corey, out of our office, made all these beautiful new components that matched a lot of our existing styling, but it was a lot. And I was like, okay, sure, we can do this. That's always my answer, given time and money and resources, which a lot of those are restricted. So I said, yeah, we could do this, but how do you approach taking on something like this and getting it done? And that's one component at a time. I've spent years being a technical architect, and that's how you digest it, is you kind of have to go through and spend the time to split it up into individual pieces and plan out how you're going to build them. So what I want to talk about today is how my team and I went about this project to build these takeovers. So I'm just going to go over some of the context, the goals and challenges we're facing. I'll talk about some of the project management structure and how we went about planning out all these tasks and splitting up that huge concept into individual pieces. From there, I'm going to talk about what I dubbed an hourglass workflow. Then I'm going to dive into some of the front-end processes. I'm not going to get too technical in this talk, but I'll give an overview of like Storybook and how we implement that. The back-end process, mainly how we implemented Layout Builder for this, and then some of the takeaways we've learned that hopefully you can all gain from. So this should cover a lot of different pieces. It's not too technical. It's not too project management-y, but it's a little bit of everything. So hopefully it works for y'all. And if it doesn't, that's all right. And if you want more information afterwards, I'll be happy to talk about it and show you some behind-the-scenes things. So for context, goals, and challenges, in context, there's the teams involved are 3 different teams. There's the web development team, which was my team, which is 3 developers, not including myself, and a QA engineer, which is awesome to have in-house. A digital product team, for the sake of this project, we had our designer who's on that team, and then 2 people who are acting kind of like project managers or project owners. And then we have a special projects team who kind of served as the stakeholders for this, because 2 people on that team were going to be actually building these pages. They're going to be in charge of them. All these teams are out of the Office of Communication, and we all talk with each other. The environments we were dealing with at the beginning of this project, our existing Drupal website, which was at the time built in Drupal 9, and we have over 120 plus editors. They're not all in there at the same exact time, thankfully, but they're all across the school. They all manage certain parts of the website, and so we had to be mindful that they're in there. We host on Pantheon. That doesn't really come into too much play in this presentation, but I thought it's good to mention, especially how we do our QA process with multi-devs. And then just for dev tools in place, if anyone's curious, we use DDev for local development. We have Storybook already in place ahead of this project. For our component library, but I'll talk about Storybook. We use Circle CI for helping with deployments and automated regression testing, and then Figma is our design tool to give the designs from our designer to the development team. And most importantly, the timeline for this project, we started planning this project in June of 2024. That's about when the when the digital product team came to me. We started development in August of 2024, so it's about 2 months. Our go live date was November of 2024, late November, basically right before Thanksgiving, because after Thanksgiving in higher ed, things kind of slow down because people go on vacation and there's holidays. So all in all, this whole project was 24 weeks. For dev time, that was going to be about 13 weeks, or it equated to 65 working days. That may seem long for what we tried to accomplish, but for the size of the team, it wasn't. And for the astute eye out there, you may notice that from planning to the go live, in between there was the call for papers for DrupalCon. So I submitted this being like, we did this successfully, and we were like 3 weeks into it. So it was that pressure from my team to get it done, and we did, or else this would have been a completely different talk, which would have been a success story for you of what not to do. So the challenges we were facing, we were adding on to a live site, which if anybody's worked on a live site, you know you have to be careful of adding new things. So we had to be mindful that we weren't going to break any existing workflows, we weren't going to impact any existing users, we weren't going to make things available until they were complete, because we didn't want people to not understand how to use something, and then we get blamed because it doesn't work when we're halfway done with it. So because of this, other work needed to continue. For our team, we had other priorities in our Jira backlog at the same time that we couldn't just ignore and focus on this the whole time. We had to do those, work on bugs if they came up, do trainings, etc. So we had to keep that in mind. How could we balance everything? And then we had no existing in-place editing experience, both on side of the development team. We hadn't worked with, say, Layout Builder before. Everything in our Drupal website followed the typical Drupal workflow of like editing a node, working on the node page. And then also for our end users, or not our end users, but our editors, they were used to that workflow. So they had no experience of being able to have a drag and drop interface of building something. So we had to keep in mind that part of this work was going to be training them on how to use it. And if anybody missed this morning, my coworker Nate, he gave a talk on how we approach our trainings and make sure people are set up for success. So you should watch that recording. It was this morning. So basically, we wanted to get it built without breaking anything. That's what every team out here wants to do, right? Who doesn't want to do this? Yeah, no hands went up for the recording. Oh, except for John Picozzi's hand went up. He likes to break things. So that was our goal and our challenge, was to get it done without breaking anything. So what really drove that was how we approach it from a project management and planning perspective. For the project management side, it came down to communication and documentation. We thought those were going to be core to us getting things done. So we wanted to follow our current Scrum workflow, which, like every team in the world, we have a modified Scrum Kanban workflow, right? Everybody has their own little flavor of it. We do too. For our daily 15-minute stand-ups before this project, it was just the dev team doing that every morning. But we had the digital product team join us so that we could rapidly talk to our designer, Corey, and give feedback and share our progress or where we were stuck on things. And we also had some open Slack channels for the team, so outside that 15-minute window, we could quickly communicate and say where we're running the problems, where we needed more details, have some automated Jira messages to say things are ready for testing or QA or UAT. And then we keep all our documentation in Confluence to keep that up to date. That's where we have like our user guides and stuff. And for this project, we stepped out of our workflow for 1 week to do a dedicated refinement and estimation meeting just for all the tasks related to this work, which I'll explain how we broke that up, so that the whole team, everybody involved, got the whole scope of how we are going to approach this project and get things to work, make sure everybody understood it from the beginning. For task tracking, just so everyone's aware, we split everything up into Jira tickets that were organized under a single epic so we could keep track of our progress in Jira. All tickets move through our swim lanes, which basically are in progress when a dev's working on it, in review when a dev's completed and gets like either a code review or our automated tools do like linting and stuff like that. Then we put it up to a multi-dev in Pantheon for QA to review it from a functional standpoint and say, yes, this works as we expect it to. Then that multi-dev moves over to our product team for user acceptance testing to say, functionally this works, but also it works for what we were expecting it to do, which is great. Then it moves to ready for production, and a developer deploys it. And then around that time as well, we do documentation. The dev team usually writes the documentation, and the product team reviews and improves the documentation we wrote to make sure it's, people can understand it, not just the developers. So that's our typical workflow. But it all centered around clear and quick communication, right? That was going to lead to our success, and I think that leads to success on building new things, and so that you can have that back and forth easily. From the technical planning perspective, this is where I spent a lot of time, those 2 months between June and August. It split into 4 different parts. One was determining what technology we needed to make this happen and to make the designs work as we expect, to break out those components to meet the designs and an editorial workflow needs. Like we wanted the drag and drop interface and make it so that not any of our editors, but our editors could do it. They didn't have to be developers to be able to build these pages. And then map out our dependencies to avoid any development bottlenecks. Again, bottlenecks would make it so we wouldn't reach our deadline, as well as would make it so that we couldn't continually work on other things because we'd be stuck. And then we wanted to ensure we had a robust QA and UAT environment to prevent any regression issues. Regression in terms of the pieces we already built for this project, right? So that we didn't accidentally break something when we changed what it was going to go into, like from a block to a layout. And also, again, we didn't want to break anything that was existing, so we wanted to make sure we thoroughly QA'd and UAT'd to make sure that any existing content or workflows or designs weren't impacted negatively. For required technology to make this project happen, first was Drupal 10. Why? Because we knew we wanted to move to like using Layout Builder or something similar, and the Drupal 10 environment was better for that than Drupal 9. Also, because we had to, right? We like to keep up to date, and we were slowly working on this, and this gave the emphasis for me to be like, we really need to be in Drupal 10 before we do this project, so I got the priority of that. And then Layout Builder and the related modules, which later on I'll cover on what additional Layout Builder modules we found helpful for this project and really improved the experience. And then it's not really technology, but we determined we had to build a content type and custom block types because of how Layout Builder works. With the content type, if we build a new one, then we wouldn't have to like retrofit an existing one. Thus, we didn't have to worry about breaking existing content. So the goals we had were two goals. For the front-end users, prevent a visually engaging experience of curated content centered around a theme or a topic based on those wonderful designs. And then for content editors, provide an intuitive interface for creating complex one-off layouts, right? We knew these pages and all the content on them were going to be unique and one-off pieces of content. So we wanted to make sure we were giving them an easy way to create that stuff and move things around until they got their takeover page the way they want it to be. So for breaking out components, the way we approached it was in these 4 basically levels. We split the whole design into sections. I'll show a demonstration of this. Then each section we split into identified entities, mainly blocks. Inside, and once we did all that for all the sections, we looked through it as a dev team to figure out which components or entities were similar enough that we could build it once and use like Drupal view modes to change the layout instead of building multiple different things. And then made sure we were thinking through the editor experience. Again, it wasn't just how could a developer put this on a page, but how could a content editor be able to easily add this and move this around to a page. So when we were breaking things out, we thought through all these 4 things. And it kind of looked like this. Here's an example from our design. This row of 3 elements here, we called those content cards, very generic name. Who here has a content card on their website? A lot of hands, yeah. And they're in a row, so we called it a content card row. And when we split this up, this section, we identified this would be a layout in Layout Builder. And if you're not familiar, in Layout Builder, layouts have regions. So this would be one region layout. And in that region, we could place a block, which would be a content card. And that block itself was composed of 3 different fields, like a media field, a link field, and a description field. Another example from our designs, what we called a content package. Again, this we identified as a layout. And then that layout we identified had 2 regions, and then the regions could contain different blocks, and those blocks had fields. So we did this for everything. And when we went through this process, for example of this, you can see how we're narrowing down our layers and starting to nest them out. And then we could identify, from the content row or the content card row and the content package, which obviously didn't have those names yet when we were doing this. These 3 things were just variants of the content card. So it identified for the development team that we could focus on building one thing, a content card, and figuring out how to display it 3 different ways depending where it's placed on the page, instead of building out 3 different block types that were kind of similar, or actually exactly similar, but we'd have to give different names to, and that would be confusing for the end users or the editors. So then we took the process of building out our tree of dependencies to figure out how we were going to prevent bottlenecks of building this. And so we took the time to think about, all right, for a content card block, to build this, it relies on having image styles, right? So we could set the image sizes and responsive image styles. And it depended on that. And that content card block itself then became a dependency of the layouts, because what's the point of having a layout if you can't put a block in it, right? We know we had to have the block in there. So the layouts depended on having the content card block, certain layouts. And then the layouts themselves were dependent on they blocked a content type, because the content type that we're going to configure as a takeover for layout builder needed to have layouts that could be added to it, which needed to have cards that could be put into them, which needed to have image styles to display their images. So we kind of did this for all the components in the design. Like that first one I showed with the 3 columns of one big design, we repeated this process for every single thing on that page and went through it as a team. That's why it took 2 months of planning it. And we ended up with this, which I'm very proud of because I love drawing graphs. I'm sorry it's hard to see in the back, but this was our dependency chart, which I drew in draw.io. And it's 47 different JIRA tickets. This is what we use for our refinement to go over it. Separated into what environments they're going to be built in, Storybook and Drupal. We have some BAT tickets there. We have a /Drupal/Storybook. And if you squint your eyes, it kind of resembles an hourglass. Like it filters down, filters out. So I was proud of that analogy, but you really have to squint at it. So just bear with me with that. So the hourglass workflow, and I think why us organizing the work in this order, which I'm going to get into, was the thing that really allowed us to do really well and meet our deadline on this. And it all came about with planning it to start and end with our smallest tasks. We want to start with the smallest pieces, build up or build down, I guess, to the biggest piece, and then do the opposite on the back end, is start with the biggest piece and split it out into the smallest tasks, and then we centralize on a single ticket, which I'll talk about. So that made it so for this hourglass or this graph, this whole top side was front-end tasks. This was work that we identified we could do basically without going into Drupal. I think this has been an end goal in Drupal. As long as I've worked in Drupal and been like a technical architect, the idea of that you could have like a front-end team building the front end without having to go into Drupal and then hand it off to the back-end team, and the back-end team didn't have to do any additional work, which for a long time, that was never the case. The front-end team would build it and give it to you, and then the Drupal developers would have to basically tear it apart and like shove it into Drupal. But we don't have to do that anymore. So we wanted to identify how could we build as much as possible to meet the design needs and get that reviewed and approved before actually building anything in Drupal. Again, so we could prevent breaking anything in Drupal, we could prevent impacting any users in Drupal, but we could be confirmed that everything we built was accessible, met the designs, and met the editorial needs as best as we could. And then the backend side became all our Drupal tasks. What entities, what configuration did we have to do in Drupal? And I'll talk about how we had them all filtered down so that we could have these things be available in our system on the website for people to be able to use and build with. So as a visual example of how we broke these dependencies down, on the front end side, I'm going to stick with content cards for the whole talk. In Storybook, which we are already using for our component library, and I'll explain how we have that set up in a little bit, we started with our content card component story, which to be able to have that in Storybook, which would allow us to visually see it rendered the way we expect it to render in Drupal with our Twig templates, we had to have the content card image styles built first. So those had to go into Drupal, but we also put them in Storybook so we could reference them in Storybook. I'll show you all this. And so on the front end side, the content card, or the image styles blocked us building the block story for the content card, which itself then blocked us building the display tickets, the front end tickets for the two different layouts, content card row and content package. Because it wouldn't make sense for us to build the front end of the layouts without being able to put anything in them to see what they look like, right? They'd just be empty shells. And then where these were small tasks that then filtered down into a single ticket, which was these layout for the front end of the layouts blocked building a story in Storybook for the whole content type. We wanted to be able to represent the whole content type in Storybook so we could see from top to bottom the design worked as we expected. And in ordering it in this way meant that our smallest tasks got triple QA'd and UAT'd. For example, when we build our content card image styles, we confirmed that the image styles were the right ratios, that the responsive images, all the image styles were there at the breakpoints. When we then put those into our content card component, we QA'd and made sure that the content card, the different variants of it, looked the way we expected, which thus in turn made sure that the image styles were still correct inside that container. Same for the layouts, because in the layouts we reference the content cards and make sure they look the way they expected to, and then the layouts get put into the takeover story. I'm going to explain how we do this. So we could confirm that not only does the whole content type look good, but all the layouts look good together and they don't change when they get nested. So we could confirm everything from the get-go. So then on the back end, we start with a single ticket, which we had block all the back-end work, which building the content type. We had to have the content type configured for layout builder, so it had to be there. And then from there, we built our layouts because we wanted to make sure they were selectable by that content type. And then once we had the layouts built, we would, for example, those two layout tasks or tickets in Jira blocked us being able to build the content card block. We didn't technically have to do this, but we did this from a QA UAT perspective to reduce confusion, because if we had built the block first and said, create the block, view the block on its own, that wouldn't give them the experience that our editors were actually going to have, which adding these things in a layout. So we want to make sure we had the layouts first. So in our QA steps, we could say, create a takeover, add a content package layout, make sure you can add a content card to it, and make sure it still looks good. And then all this filtered down into user permissions, which is how we kind of controlled the launch of this, all of this work. So we had essentially 3 blocker tickets in this workflow. On the front end side, everything we built in Storybook, as I mentioned, filtered down into having a single story that represented the whole content type and had all our smaller pieces nested inside of it. On starting the back end work, we started with a single story, or a single ticket, sorry, of building the content type so we could put everything into it. And we actually had the Storybook representation of the takeover content type block the building of the content type, because we wanted to have that in place, the front end in place, so that we could then, when we build the content type, we could take the Drupal template and just push the variables to a component template. And then at the bottom of the back end, we had everything filtered down to a single user permissions. And so this was like our launch ticket. It got a gold star because we could build all this stuff in Drupal on the back end and we just had the admin user being able to access them. And so the last story was be able to add to our specific user roles the ability to access this content type and access these block types. So in one go, with one little push, everything was in place, but it's kind of like a feature flag was turned on because we updated the permissions. It made it really easy for launch day. We then also, I just want to add, we had regression tickets, right? We didn't want to break anything that was already there. So in the graph, it was at the very bottom underneath our backend tickets. We have BHAT that we use for our regression testing that runs nightly and on every build that we do, every PR. And so, for example, we'd take, once we had the content card block built and the user permissions updated, we'd build BHAT tests to make sure those users could actually create those blocks and they had the fields we expect. Same thing for like the content type. We did fudge this a little bit because before we did user permissions, we built the BHAT test and then we just updated them with the additional user roles that could access the content. All right. Still with me? Yeah, all right, good. Thank you. Should have coffee in this room. No, you're doing great. So our front-end process, how we built everything, as I mentioned many times, was centered around Storybook. Again, we wanted to build as much as possible outside of Drupal to make sure our designs worked, but we wanted to use the templates that were going to be used by Drupal because we didn't want to have to double up our work with our small team and our deadline. So Storybook, if you're not familiar, it's a Node JavaScript-based interactive component library. It provides interactive controls, which I usually map to fields for components. So you could pass variables in these controls that get rendered, get passed to the template and rendered as you might expect user input. We only enable Storybook on our dev local environments and our QA environments. I'm not going to talk about exactly how we trigger that to be turned on and off, but I'll be happy to discuss it later on. But that we don't have it available on a production website. It's only for testing purposes at the moment. Some of the modules and plugins we use for Storybook, we use CL Server module from Drupal. This is pre-single directory components, and we had Storybook. We've been using it for about 2 years. So that was before single directory components came into play. This was like the precursor to that, and we already had that set up. I didn't want to do the work of rebuilding all our existing Storybook components for this project, right? We didn't want to break existing things, so we stuck with that for now. That allows us to render our twig files from Storybook in Drupal using the Drupal twig engine, as Drupal would render it and then sends that through an API back to Storybook. To make that happen, Storybook has a Lullabot Storybook add-on that we use to facilitate that conversation between Drupal and Storybook for rendering purposes. And then one of the things I wanted to highlight, we use Storybook Alley plugin, which allows us to check every story in Storybook for accessibility needs. So we could confirm that everything we were building was accessible. We also do accessibility audits with a partner, but we wanted to make sure the developers had this in hand so we could just be on our best foot to start. So what required a story in Storybook? Image styles, as I mentioned. All our different block types we identified, we wanted a story for those so we could see them in isolation and their variants. All our layouts we provided stories for so we could check how the blocks worked when they were put into a layout. And then our content type. And we kind of built them, right? This is in the order of smallest to largest, and that's how we went about building them. Again, it was to build out as much as possible without going into Drupal, because I've had the experience, and I don't think it's the greatest one, when like you build the entity in Drupal, like the block type in Drupal, and you figure out, actually, this isn't the best way we want to do this. And then you have to like rebuild it. If it's deployed, you have to change fields, and it's hard. So we wanted to build as much out as possible without Drupal. So if we wanted to change around how fields work, figure out different controls, we could do it there, and then figure out how to do that in the entities on the backend side. For our component files, so I should step back from that. Well, for our Storybook files, the way we have it organized, and there's different ways to do this, and if you're using, again, single directory components, if you're going to do something like this today, I'd recommend going that approach. But again, we already had a structure set up. In our theme, we have a Storybook directory that Storybook looks into. And inside there, we have a type directory, so like blocks, content types, layouts. Inside there, we have a directory for the name of the component. I'm going to show a version of this that will make sense. And for each component, we have a component.yaml file, which explains all the metadata for that component, including any Drupal libraries you need. We have the stories.yaml file, which explains what controls and parameters should be provided in Storybook for controlling that element. And then we have a twig file, which we use to then take those Storybook controls and pass along to an abstracted template that gets all the styling done. So for the content card structure, it looks like this. In our custom theme, we have Storybook. Then we have blocks. Inside blocks, we have content card. And inside content card, we have a content card component YAML, the stories YAML with our 3 variants, and then our content card twig, which would pass variables to a component template, which I'll explain. So here, I'll show this live instead of this screenshot here. So here is, oh yes, it still loads. Here is our Storybook implementation. This is running locally in my DDev. And as an example, I'm sorry in the back, I don't know what's gonna happen if I make it bigger. Let's see. Okay, it's not too bad. So here I have on the blocks section, I have a content card, and we have it rendered. And here I have like, here's the link text. Is it an external link or internal link? What should the eyebrow text be? What the description should be? This is new, so ignore that. That's for some upcoming work. And then we have stories for the different variations, like when it's featured and when it's in teaser. All right, so you can't see the variations when I'm zoomed in, so I'm gonna zoom it out. And I know it's small. So they look slightly differently, right? And so we could test these here and see that they look the way our designs look, the way we expect in Storybook. So I mentioned we really use a component structure, or what we consider a component template or twig file, to abstract everything from either Storybook or Drupal for every component we build. So again, this is in our custom theme. We have a components directory. Again, with single directory components, you don't have to do all this. And then we have a name for that component. We have like the Sass file, the twig file, any variant twig files, any JavaScript that's needed, which we reference the Sass and technically the compiled Sass and the JavaScript in our custom themes libraries YAML file. So for the content card structure for this, in components, we have content card. So we have content card Sass and twig. We have like --featured.twig and --teaser.twig. And then we have our custom libraries to call that Sass file. So to conceptualize the whole structure of this for everybody, on the Storybook side, we have a story, content card story, which itself in the metadata can call a Drupal library. So we say like include the content card library or the component SAS. And then the story passes its controls, like what should the title text be? What should the link text be? To a story.twig. And that twig passes twig variables to a component.twig. And I know this looks a little strange. Hopefully it'll make sense in a moment. On the Drupal side, just to give you the full picture, right? Well, you create an entity, like a content card block. That entity then in your theme gets a entity.html.twig file, right? Content card or block -- content card. We take that, and that we include using a library attach to attach the Drupal library, and we pass the variables to the component.twig file. So that component.twig, it's abstracted enough that it doesn't care where the values of the variables are coming from. It just knows it has to render them into its markup. So it can come from Drupal or Storybook. They're both using the same template, the same twig code, so we could verify whatever we see in Storybook, we know it's what we're going to see in Drupal. Does this make sense? All right. Yeah, all right. Thumbs up for a graph. Yes. So the value of this is we were able, as I mentioned, to nest components. This allowed us, in Storybook, you can reference twig files like you do twig includes. And so we could reference our smaller stories into our larger stories. When we built the Storybook story for the content card row, we have a control for asking how many content cards you want in that row. It's a slider. And depending on that, in our Storybook story row twig file, we would say, all right, they say they want 3, so in a loop, call the content card twig file and pass like lorem ipsum to it and generate 3 cards for us. Again, this allowed for multiple rounds of QA and UAT on all the smaller components. And as we built them up, everything got triple checked. So we knew we didn't break anything as we were adding more to it. And we did this for all our blocks, all our layouts, and all our content types. In the graph form of how this works, we have our content card row story. This is the layout that you can specify how many cards you want to display in Storybook, which I'll show you. In there, for that, we pass the control of saying we want 3 content cards, and that, again, loops for our content card Storybook twig file to render that. That calls the component, it does all the things, and that gets passed to our layout twig file, which is itself a component twig file that the Drupal version will call. So what that looks like here, I have a layout section down here. I'm sorry for those in the back. And we have content card row. Look at that fun little animation. And so like I have number of cards. We specify 2 to 3 cards. And so I say, all right, I want 3 cards. And look at it generates 3 cards with the fun placeholder images using our image styles. And these are calling the same twig file, passing the same controls as the content card story. So if we knew if something was wrong here, we just had to update it on the content card level itself. And then we can confirm that it still looked good. And then we put in additional controls, like so you can change the first card, DrupalCon, right? And it changes it live here, which is good for our developer or for our designer because, designs don't capture really long text usually. So we could really vary and see what things look like with different amounts of text. And then I'm gonna skip over this, but we did the same thing for the whole content type, right? On our Takeover story, we built in controls for turning on the different layouts on and off, so we could see how they work together before we built anything in Drupal. That called the layout stories, which called the different block stories, etc. You get the idea. And that looked like this in Layout Builder. I have content types Takeover here. And look at those beautiful balloons. And everything's here, all our different components. These are all calling themselves Storybook stories and rendering them, passing dummy content. And we actually, again, I'm sorry in the back down below, but we have a control for every single layout story to turn it on and off. So basically for content package, I can say false. And now this whole layout renders without that content package component in it. So we can see relatively as much as possible without providing crazy ability to like reorder things, how everything worked together to make sure nothing was negatively impacting each other, which saved us a lot of time. Who here has ever built something and realized it broke another component on your page? Yeah, a bunch of hands. So we wanted to avoid that. So basically we verified all the front end output worked before starting the Drupal work. And I want to say the front end side of this hourglass, if you squint your eyes, took the most amount of time versus the back end side. So the back end side of what we did, we had some prerequisites, as I mentioned. We wanted to get to Drupal 10. We did that ahead of time. We actually did that during the front end piece, and I got to do that. And I had a lot of fun doing it, a lot of frustrations doing it as well. And we had to install Layout Builder and determine what modules would make sense for the editor experience we wanted to give. Which for those modules, just to list out, I think it's 4 or 5 additional ones we added. There we go. We did Layout Builder Additions, which provides UI improvements for using Layout Builder for editors. We use the Layout Builder iframe modal, which renders like the block edit screens in a modal instead of like the off-canvas menu, which we thought was a better experience for our users. We use the Layout Builder Reorder, which allows you to reorder sections on a page. It's not drag and drop. It's like the old style, like move up one, move down one sort of order. But it's great because then they can easily move whole sections around. Layout Builder Restrictions, I think, is the most important one we installed. This allowed us on a content type and a layout type, each individual layout, we could restrict what blocks are selectable. So we could say for the content card row, you can only select inline content card blocks. You can only create blocks of those types so that people don't add content we don't want them to add to certain layouts. And then Layout Builder Direct Add just simplified the block selection. Again, it reduces the need to open that off-canvas menu. And I'll show all this in a moment. Here, I'll show it real quick right now. So like here's my layout, and like here's a content card row. No, I can add more than 3. Shh, don't tell our editors. But if I click Add Block, it only gives me the option to add a content card block, which opens up a nice little modal here, which makes it nice and easy to do it in context. Or if I can edit this here, same thing with the modal configure, right? So it makes it easy for the editor experience, which we wanted to keep in mind. So for the backend tasks, we needed to create and configure our content types, outside of installing Layout Builder. We had to create and configure our layouts. You do this with a layouts file. We had to create and configure our blocks, right? Our block entities, content cards, etc. And then configure our user permissions. Again, these all kind of built into each other. We did in this order. We built the content type first of Takeover. To that, we added layouts that were selectable. To that, we added blocks that could be added to those layouts, just to reduce the amount of time and make sure that the way QA and UAT was happening was the way our end users, our editors, were going to be using this stuff, and then configure user permissions for the launch. For the content card row layout configuration, I can show this live as well. So this is, again, this is small here. I can make this bigger. These are the layout options for our Takeover content type, and for the content cards row layout, I can say, restrict by region, which doesn't make sense here because it's just one region, but then I can have which blocks I want to allow for this specific layout on this specific content type. And here we only allow content cards, right, to restrict that editor experience. I already showed this, right, doing everything with the iframe and whatnot. But the remaining backend tasks at this point, right, for every component, every piece we wanted to build on the backend, all this piece was done and verified, triple checked, that we knew the front end side of every block, every layout, the content type was done and dusted and approved and accessible and all that. So on the back end, all we had to do at this point was in Drupal define our entities with their fields, take in our custom theme, the entity twig file, and do like a library, attach library to include the Drupal library, and then pass the twig variables to the component.twig file. It made it super simple and easy for the backend side of things to happen. And this actually made the backend work be really rapid. Like, we turned these out really quickly and allowed us to do this work and double check this work really quickly, and then get our regression testing in place. And then launch. What we did for launch was, again, update user permissions. Everything was in place. We tested it with the admin role, or a version of the admin role. And all we had to do was for the stakeholders who are going to be building this content, for the user role they had, we just had one ticket where we updated the user permissions, and that was our launch. We pushed that out. We released that. It was kind of weird. We use a version, what's the versioning system we use? I should know it. No, whatever. It doesn't matter. I should know this. I gave a DrupalCon talk about the versioning system. Anyways, we just had to push one ticket, and it was like magic. This was available, and then Nate could go ahead and train our stakeholders on how to build it, which he did a wonderful job of, and they were super excited. So much so that last week I was in the office, and I saw one of our stakeholders, Alyssa, I saw on her screen, I was like, oh, that looks like you're building a takeover. She's like, yeah. I'm like, how is it? She's like, at first it was like writing with my left hand, which I'm a left-handed person, so I was like, okay. Well. But she's like, now I get it. She's like, and I'm thinking what else we can do with this. I'm super excited for it. I was like, great, that's what I was hoping. So the end result, did we meet our goal? Yes, we did. Here is, now it's zoomed in. No, I'm going to log out so you can see. Admin, log out. No, now I got to go back to that page. Not a new tab. I hit Command R to refresh. Naming my keyboard shortcuts that Nate explained to me to do. So here's the actual takeover page, and it looks just like the design, and it works for our content editors that they can build these things, they can reorder these things. They're all unique. They're limited to what they can add, but they don't feel limited. They feel like they have the control to build these unique implementations. And not only do we meet our goal, but I believe, Nate can correct me if I'm wrong, or Rob can, I think we finished a week early. We finished a week early. Not only that, I had mentioned we had other work to do. This whole project, we split into 47 tickets. In the time period that we did the work, the 13 weeks, the 65 working days, we completed 80 tickets in Jira. The 4 of us. 5 of us. So that means this project took half of our time, and we were able to keep other things moving, and we exceeded our goal. So I was very proud of the team. They did an amazing job. It's probably because I told them this was for DrupalCon, and they're like, gotta impress Mike. Gotta make me look good. So our takeaways. Approach large projects one component at a time. That's the only way to do it. If you're new to architecture or you're not new, just remember that. Just like break it down to the smallest pieces you can. Strive to get everything you built without breaking anything else. That should be your number one goal. Clear and quick communication is vital. For internally amongst developers, for your talking with your stakeholders or your product owners or your designers, making sure there's those clear avenues of communication so when people are blocked, people aren't sure what to do, you can talk through it and make rapid progress. Break out components from designs by splitting them into distinct layers, into smaller and smaller pieces, and then from those small pieces, find common patterns and determine what can be the same component and save yourself a lot of building time. For that squinty hourglass workflow, start and end with the smallest tasks. What's the smallest things you can do, and then build up from them to see what makes sense so that you can replicate the way they're going to be used and the way your editors are going to use them, and then filter it down the same way, right? Start with the biggest piece, like the content type, split it up into, in terms of layout builder, layouts, and then split those into blocks, and then split those blocks into, user permissions, etc. And then in the front end, build out as much as possible without Drupal using agnostic templates. I think, again, I'm going to mention for single directory components, it's even easier to do this than what we have set up. We have in our backlog to start moving over single directory components so we can reduce. We have, you saw for every component, we have like 3 different twig files and 3 different folders for things. We're going to be able to reduce that for single directory components. But strive to do that. I think that's been the end goal in Drupal for a long time, and now we actually have the tools to do it really well. And then focus on backend tasks for only entity creation and configuring those entities to allow for rapid completion. Because if you can do as much as possible in the front end, that should be all that's left on your back end, with some intricacies here and there and some caveats here and there. But in general, if you can do it this way, I think you can really streamline your development process. Look at that, right on time. So I want to thank you again. I have annotated version of these slides, which has more description of everything and a breakdown of everything so that you can remember what I said. If you have this link, bit.ly dcon25 takeover, which is where this QR code takes you. And then I'll take questions after applause. Thank you. Question.
How creative are your editors getting with the components, and what's maintenance like?
So far,
Asking for
yeah,
new things
yeah.
as you
So the
time progresses.
So the question was, how creative are our editors getting with this, and what's the maintenance been like? They've been pretty creative with it. They still haven't actually launched a takeover. Like it hasn't taken over the homepage yet, but I've seen them building a lot of different things, and they've come to talk to us like, how can we do this sort of workflow in other places? How can we use this in other places? And we're continuing to add to it. Right now, the team that's not here at DrupalCon, but the team back in the office is working on some new components and new layouts already that have been identified to add to it. They're like, what if we had like a questions and answers block and layout? So we're continuing to get that feedback as they're playing with it without even launching it yet, without building anything that's public yet. So it's been really great feedback, it's allowed us to do these things rapidly with this framework in mind of doing it in Storybook, approving it, it looks good, and then just build the entities in the back end. And it's super quick. Yes?
I'm curious about where you insert accessibility reviews throughout this whole process. You just do it once at the beginning in Storybook? Are you doing it all the way through? And even after the fact, especially, have you thought about building this so that it will continue to be accessible when you've got users going in and moving shit around and whatever?
Yeah, so the question was, where do we take into account accessibility? Is just the beginning, just the end, randomly? We take accessibility very, it's very important to us at MIT Sloan. And so we do it at every phase. So before the designs even reached me, like I said, we work with a company called Perkins Access, which is from Perkins School for the Blind. It's their professional arm. And so our designer, Corey, had his designs reviewed by their accessibility specialist, just to be like, tweak the colors here, change the structure here. And then when we built the components, not only do we review them in Storybook with that Alley plugin, but then also we use some other tools, like the in-browser tools to confirm it. And as we were building out the content type, once we got to the Drupal side, we built out an example one and we sent that to Perkins to be like, can you check this for accessibility workflow? Does it work still? And they're like, yeah, like they gave us some ideas for like how to tweak the JavaScript for the animations and stuff like that. So we keep it in mind, and then we continually do accessibility reviews of the website, which will include this new content. So we get that feedback back and it goes right into our backlog. It usually goes to the top of our backlog and we address it there. So great question. Anything else? Yes?
You mentioned that you were able to turn on and off new components on Storybook. Does that include the full library of those components?
Yeah, so the question was, I mentioned that we could turn all the components on and off in Storybook. So here's my takeover story, right? And so I have, you don't care about the header. Here's our different layouts, right? We have the content card row, the button cards, content package, content tiles, a lot of content things, quotes, and date icons. So yeah, I could turn these all off, which is representative of when someone first creates this content in Layout Builder. Like we have some fields that are on the content type, which is mainly for the header, and this is what it looks like. I can't even scroll. There's nothing there. So it's basically just seeing the header. So yeah, that was one of the things we wanted to make sure we understood what the editors were going to see when they first did something, and then we just turn these on as we want. So here's quotes, and so we can see if they only build it with quotes. I'll just close these. Like there's the quote. And it's a carousel quote. Yay, carousels. We had a lot of discussions about how to do this, which we made sure the controls were accessible, for example, for this. So we tested the accessibility of the controls and stuff like that. So yes, we can turn them all off. Did I answer your question? I'm sorry.
I mean more like for any existing...
Oh, for any existing...
Yeah. So like if you wanted to repurpose a component that you built for a different content type and you wanted to integrate it into this, is that an easy way to...
Yeah, so the question was like, for any existing components we had, could we easily integrate it? The answer is generally yes. So as we implemented Storybook about 2 years ago, every time we go to touch an existing component, we build a Storybook story for it if we don't have it already, so that we can test those things. For example, we have like 4 different profile types on our website, but we abstracted it to have one profile component. And then we have examples of like, here's a student profile, which is that component built in here with a little bit of different things. So we wanted to check that we could do that for the one for like Takeover. Here's the quote template, which is slightly different, but very closely the same. So this allowed us to reference existing things. Like, we have quotes on the Takeover. It might actually use this abstracted one, I forget, so that we could reuse what we had there. But yeah, if you build it in that way, you definitely can do that and it saves a lot of time. Back there, yes.
Did you have Figma linked in, and how did the developers use that?
question was, do we have Figma LinkedIn, and how did the developers use that? So I will also confess that when we started this project, since it was last year, it was before Simply shut down, and we were in Simply at the time, and we've converted everything to Figma. So the way it worked, we had handoffs of assets in our Jira tickets that linked to like the Figma designs. Storybook does have a Figma plugin, which I'm excited to be able to use now that we have all our old designs from Simply put into Figma. I want to connect them this way. So it's easier for our designer or our QA person to, there'll be a tab. Here you can't see it, but we have an accessibility tab. There should be a Figma tab here that we can link to the component in Figma for this, so we can compare them to make sure, does this look like the design? So the way we did that for this project was just handoffs of links inside of the Jira tickets. Not my favorite way, but it allowed us to move forward. Yes?
On your layouts, when you're determining they're going to do either a 2 or a 3 card,
Yeah.
are you doing it at the section? Like, are they determining that when they're putting the section in, or?
Yeah, so, all right, here's... Yeah, so the idea, here's another one. This is called content tiles, and we have a control here between 4 to 6. This is a hard and fast rule in Storybook that you can only add between 4 and 6. Technically, in Layout Builder, they can add here. Where's one here? Here's 4 here. I could add 8 of them if I wanted to. There is a module for Layout Builder about being able to restrict how many you can put in, but the way we didn't end up using that because it's per instance of a layout of a section. So the way I read it is when I would like configure, I guess I'll say if I configured this here in, maybe I can't configure it here. When you configure the section, when you add a section, that module would give you like how many blocks are allowed in here. And I didn't want it on per instance because that would mean the editor would have to set that. I want to set that like I configure restrictions. And at least the modules I found didn't do that yet. And so we had to put in that caveat in our user documentation, like add between 4 and 6, don't add more. But we talked to our designers, like people technically can. So until we can build that functionality in, we just kind of have to teach people not to do it.
So just to ask,
Yeah.
so in this case, you've got the whatever blocks are there, just adding block into
Yep.
there, and it's setting it side by side.
Yeah.
Not by like columns.
Right. Right. Yeah, because that was the other thing for responsiveness, right? That these will shift. That doesn't look good with Layout Builder turned on. But yeah, because everything was built responsively, which also I didn't mention, but you can check that in Layout Builder as well. In Storybook, I can say, here, show me what this looks like in mobile. Right, and I can do that all here. It's really cool. Great question, thank you. Anything else? All right, give yourselves wait, we got one, Chris.
Just that this is such a meticulous and highly evolved solution. Do you have any plans for the future of sharing the code?
There's no real custom code to share.
Storybook side probably has some configuration details that could be involved here.
Yeah, it probably does. So all the way we configured our Storybook to work with Drupal, I just followed Mateo's documentation in the CL Server modules Drupal page and Lullabot's Storybook add-on documentation. So it's pretty straightforward. Like I said, even now like there's a Storybook module for Drupal, and single directory components makes all that like you don't have to do much configuration at all. So we have plans to move to single directory components. Surprise team, I have plans for us to move to single directory components. So that we can make that even easier for us. So good question. But yeah, that's the trick is there wasn't anything super unique we had to do here, super specific or super special. We just had to figure out when and how to build things in order. Yes?
2 takeaways I wanted to add. You mentioned that our product team joined our stand-up for this process. It was so helpful, we've carried it over.
That's true. So Nate's comment, just for the recording, is we invited the product team to our daily stand-ups for this project, and they've stayed on since this project launched in November, which has increased our ability to get feedback and move forward on stuff.
And the other one, the diagram you made was a guiding light through this whole process. I don't think you gave it enough credit.
I love my diagrams so much. I would say, we spent 2 months of planning. Like a week of that was me building a graph. And I was so happy with it. And I kept it updated. Like I would change colors. I had check marks when we completed things. And we linked that in our documentation. We did confidence documentation for the project. And I embedded the draw.io diagram in there so that anybody on the team could go and be like, how much of this is visually done? And it really helped the team. So good point. All right. I think I'm out of time, but I'll keep talking about this. Thank you so much.